When the morning sun hit the glass, his equation burned gold and changed everything. Columbia's rooftops were pale with frost that dawn, their metal rails humming softly in the wind that came down the Hudson. Far below, the campus still slept. Steam rose from the vents of Hamilton Hall like the breath of some vast, drowsy beast. A janitor's son, wrapped in a borrowed coat 2 sizes too big, climbed the final iron rung and pulled himself onto the roof. Elias Rowan paused, chest heaving. The city unfurled beneath him, a gray ocean of stone and glass. He could almost hear the distant traffic sighing over Broadway. For a moment, he forgot the cold biting his fingers. Up here, no guard could tell him to leave. No professor could remind him of the doors he was not allowed to open. He set down his backpack. Inside were 3 things: a notebook whose cover had split at the spine, a black marker, and an old calculator with a cracked screen. He ran his thumb over the marker's tip, inhaling the sharp scent of ink. The glass wall before him was clear and immense. The top window of the graduate laboratory where the university's elite research team worked on flow dynamics. He had spent weeks mopping their floors, emptying their trash, studying their equations in silence while pretending not to listen. That night, they had celebrated a failed experiment as if it were a victory. He had watched through the half-open door, hearing laughter that smelled of wine and privilege. Someone had said, "If even Hensley couldn't solve it 30 years ago, no one will." And then, as the lights dimmed, he had seen the professor himself, white-haired, stooped, staring at the board with an expression that was not defeat, but something lonelier, a kind of mourning. Elias knew the story. Everyone at Columbia did. Professor Leonard Hensley, once hailed as a prodigy of theoretical physics, had vanished from the public eye after an accident in the aeronautics lab took his colleague's life. The problem they had worked on, the unstable formulation of the Navier-Stokes continuum, was said to have died with it. But to Elias, the problem had not died. It had merely been exiled, like him. He uncapped the marker. The first line squeaked against the frozen glass. Symbols bloomed where the city lights shimmered. He wrote fast, breath forming clouds that dissolved into the dawn. Every mark felt like a rebellion carved in light. He did not care that his fingers were numb, that the wind threatened to tear the notebook from his grasp. All that mattered was the pattern unfolding in his mind, the missing symmetry between pressure divergence and time decay. Below, the lab's windows glowed faintly blue. Somewhere behind those walls, a world of privilege carried on, oblivious. Up here, he was writing to no one, and to everyone. He paused. His reflection stared back at him, a thin young man with tired eyes, dark hair plastered by sweat, and the trace of defiance that poverty had burned into him. He remembered the bursar's office, the polite smile when they told him his scholarship had been reallocated. He remembered scrubbing tiles while other students defended theses. He remembered his mother's cough echoing in their small apartment across Riverside Drive, where she stitched uniforms for people who would never learn her name. He pressed the marker harder. Equations spiraled outward like constellations, partial derivatives, turbulence tensors, fragments of memory. The rooftop wind keened, scattering bits of paper from his notebook across the ledge. Each gust carried a line from his notes. Nonlinear viscous flow. Temporal collapse. Integrate by rotation symmetry. He whispered them aloud, as if naming stars. Hours passed unnoticed. The eastern sky blushed, and suddenly the world tilted into light. Sunlight struck the window, igniting every symbol he had drawn. The equations flared in gold, mirrored across the adjacent tower, a cathedral of mathematics suspended above the sleeping campus. Elias stepped back, eyes wide, as if seeing proof that truth could be beautiful. For a heartbeat, he felt infinite. Then a door slammed somewhere below. The echo startled him. He snapped the cap back on the marker, grabbed his bag, and crouched behind the ventilation shaft. Through the narrow gap between ducts, he saw a shadow on the stair landing, a security guard doing his rounds. Elias's pulse hammered. If they caught him here again, he would lose his job, maybe be expelled from the maintenance crew entirely. Footsteps receded. Silence returned, heavier now. He exhaled shakily and looked once more at the glass. The sunlight was fading. The golden letters dimmed, returning to pale ghost lines. He pressed his palm against the cold surface, leaving a fog print that overlapped with the symbols. Somewhere inside that labyrinth of ink and breath was the solution he had dreamed about for years. He whispered, almost in prayer, "Please let someone see it before the rain does." Down on the quad, Professor Hensley was already awake. The old man's gait was slow but deliberate as he crossed the cobblestones, coffee in hand. He had stopped sleeping long ago. Each morning he wandered the campus before sunrise, chasing echoes of a life he could no longer touch. When he looked up, the first light caught on the tall glass of the laboratory tower. For an instant, he thought his eyes deceived him. On the rooftop pane shimmered lines of fire, elegant, furious, alive. He froze. The cup trembled in his hand. 30 years ago, he had seen those same variables dancing on a blackboard seconds before the explosion that had taken his friend. The world had called it an accident. He had called it a sin he would never atone for. Yet here, reborn in sunlight, the same mathematics burned like an answered prayer. Students began to cross the yard, their chatter slicing through the quiet. Hensley blinked, and the glow was gone, leaving only the reflection of clouds. Still, he stood rooted, heart pounding, certain that what he had seen was no trick of the light. Above, Elias remained hidden, unaware that his secret had been seen. He wrapped his notebook in a scarf, slid it back into his pack, and began his descent down the maintenance ladder. Every rung creaked with cold. When his boots touched the ground, he kept to the shadows, passing dumpsters, steam vents, the smell of detergent from the laundry hall. His breath formed small ghosts behind him. He reached the janitor's corridor just as the first students began arriving. He exchanged nods with the morning crew, who thought of him as the quiet boy who worked nights and studied by the vending machines. No one noticed the smudge of black ink on his fingers or the tiny spark of triumph in his eyes. Inside the maintenance closet, he set the bag down, wiped the condensation from his hair, and stared at the mop bucket that had been his companion for months. On the wall hung a safety poster. Authorized personnel only beyond this point. The words made him smile bitterly. Authorization was for those born into permission. Discovery, he thought, belonged to whoever could climb high enough to see. That evening, as the city darkened, the wind rose again over Hamilton Hall. Tiny droplets froze along the glass, sealing the ink beneath a film of ice. Yet the equation remained visible, faint but indelible, as if the building itself refused to forget. And far below, in his small office, Professor Hensley opened an old drawer and took out a yellowed photograph. 2 young men at a chalkboard, one of them himself, the other forever lost to the experiment. He stared at the photo, then at the window, whispering to the empty room, "Whoever you are, you've just woken the past." Outside, unseen, the rooftop shivered under a veil of frost, holding the equation that would soon shake the world. The frost had thickened overnight, turning Columbia's rooftops into silver plains. From the river came a low moan of wind, brushing over the windows of Hamilton Hall, where the rooftop glass still bore faint traces of a vanished hand. Professor Leonard Hensley stood in the courtyard below, staring up at that pane again. He had returned before dawn, drawn by something he could not name. To anyone passing, he was only an aging physicist out for a walk, but inside the silence of 30 years cracked open like ice beneath his feet. He adjusted his spectacles. The golden flare he'd seen yesterday was gone, yet the pattern remained. A ghost of equations scrawled in overlapping arcs. Each symbol was slightly distorted by the frost, but the logic behind them glowed unmistakably. He whispered, "God help me. It's the missing vector form." The janitor sweeping leaves nearby looked up. "Sorry, Professor?" "Nothing," Hensley murmured, waving it off. But his heart would not settle. Up on the roof, Elias Rowan crouched behind the ventilation unit, watching the professor's small figure below. He had come back before sunrise, carrying a rag and a bottle of solvent. His plan was to wipe the glass clean before anyone noticed. But now, seeing the old man gazing upward, he hesitated. He knew that face. Every student in the physics department did, even if most never dared to speak to him. Professor Hensley, once the youngest full chair at Columbia, the man whose silence carried more weight than most men's words. Rumors said he had destroyed his own research after the lab explosion that killed his partner. Others whispered that he'd gone mad chasing a proof no one believed in. And now that man was staring at his equations. Elias pressed himself against the ductwork, heart hammering. What if he recognized the handwriting? No, impossible. He had written with his gloves on, his strokes shaky from cold. Still, something inside him stirred between terror and awe, the thought that perhaps someone had seen the pattern, had understood. He remembered the moment the sunlight struck the glass, the brief, impossible shimmer, and how alive it had made him feel. It wasn't just math, it was language. A message written to the sky because the earth refused to listen. Below, Hensley took a photograph on his phone, zooming in on the symbols. The frost made them imperfect, but fragments were still legible. He printed the image back in his office and began tracing lines on transparent film, overlaying them with the old research from the 1990s. The resemblance was undeniable. Whoever had written this understood not only the foundation of Navier-Stokes, but the hidden symmetry his late partner, Dr. Irving Marlowe, had hinted at in his final notes. The symmetry Hensley himself had buried after the accident. He closed his eyes, hearing again the blast, the scream, the silence afterward. 30 years. And now, it returns. He dialed the security office. "I need rooftop access records from last night, maintenance, cleaning, anyone." "Yes, sir. We'll check the logs." "Do it quietly," Hensley added. "And don't erase the footage." Meanwhile, Elias was scrubbing floors 3 levels below. His supervisor, Mr. Hanley, barked orders through the hallway. "Keep your head down, Rowan. The physics department's jumpy this week. Something about vandalism." "Vandalism?" Elias repeated. "Yeah. Somebody wrote formulas on the lab windows. The professors are having a fit. Can you imagine? Writing math on glass? These geniuses need to get hobbies." He laughed, shaking his head. Elias forced a smile, but his pulse quickened. Vandalism. That was what they'd call it. To him, it was prayer. At lunch, he hid in the maintenance supply closet, unwrapped a sandwich, and opened his notebook. The pages were damp, the ink smeared where the cold had bitten through his gloves, but the equations still made sense to him. He studied them line by line, his finger tracing the incomplete section near the end, the divergence term he had yet to balance. He knew the answer lived somewhere in the relationship between turbulence and time, but the math refused to settle. He stared at the final blank space and whispered, "What are you hiding?" Above, clouds gathered again. The world outside his small, windowless closet was turning gray. That evening, when the building emptied, Elias climbed back to the rooftop. Snow had begun to fall in slow, deliberate flakes. He wiped the remaining frost with a rag and stared at what was left of his writing. Most of the lines were fading, but the memory of them still pulsed behind his eyes. He uncapped his marker once more. One more try. His breath fogged the air as he added corrections. Tiny arcs, symbols, directional arrows. Every sound was muffled by the snow. Each stroke felt sacred, a conversation not with people, but with something greater. The sky darkened. A few windows below glowed faintly. Graduate students pulling all-nighters, their screens reflecting equations Elias could never officially write. He thought of them, their badges, their lab coats. Then he looked down at his calloused hands, the cheap gloves his mother had sewn patches into. He smiled bitterly. The world built its walls out of polished titles, but no wall could stop a mind that refused to kneel. Downstairs, Professor Hensley's curiosity had turned into obsession. He printed the photo in higher contrast, inverted the colors, and laid it beside the old notes from 1993. The match was exact. Even the error term was identical to one he and Marlowe had once debated during their final night together. Only a handful of people on Earth could have derived it independently. He whispered, "Whoever you are, you understand." He left his office and climbed the north stairwell toward the rooftop. The key in his hand trembled as he unlocked the door and stepped into the freezing air. Snow swirled around him, catching in his beard. Then he saw it. Fresh lines glowing faintly in the dim light, written by a hand too steady to belong to a vandal. He moved closer, eyes wide. The handwriting was raw, imperfect, but brilliant. The equation was nearly complete. "Impossible," he breathed. "You finished the boundary condition." Then he noticed something that made his heart tighten. A footprint near the ledge, small and alone. Whoever wrote this had stood barefoot for better balance on the slick surface. The thought of it, this anonymous mind, risking his life for an equation, shook him to the core. Hensley whispered into the wind, "Who are you, rooftop ghost?" Elias, crouched behind the air vent, heard every word. The professor's voice carried the weight of both awe and grief. He bit his lip to stay silent, though every instinct screamed to answer. To step out. To say, "It was me." But he didn't. Not yet. He wasn't ready for the disbelief, the laughter, the inevitable accusation of theft. Instead, he waited until the professor turned away. Then, while the old man lingered by the stairwell, Elias took one step forward and used his breath to trace a single symbol onto the fogged glass. /T, the time derivative. The last piece. When Hensley turned back, he froze. The symbol was there, glowing faintly in the condensation. For a moment, neither of them moved. The old man raised his hand, almost reverently, but the figure was already fading, evaporating into the cold night air. He whispered, "A conversation, through glass." He left the rooftop shaken, unaware that Elias was still kneeling there, hands trembling from cold and wonder. For the first time in years, Elias felt seen, not as a janitor's son or a trespasser, but as something else entirely. He didn't know what would come next. He only knew that he had to keep writing. As he descended the ladder, he glanced one last time at the pane. The wind caught the fresh ink, scattering it like pollen. And beneath the falling snow, the rooftop equation waited, half miracle, half confession, between two souls separated by glass and decades. Snow still veiled the rooftops when Professor Leonard Hensley arrived at his office the next morning. The hallways were empty. the floors gleaming with that quiet stillness only universities know before dawn. He closed the door behind him and set down a stack of old journals, his own, bound in cracked leather, heavy with ink and regret. For most of the faculty, this was just another winter morning. But for Hensley, the world had changed. Somewhere above, an invisible hand had resurrected a formula he had sworn would never be written again. The rooftop equation, as the janitors now whispered about it, haunted him like a ghost. He lowered himself into the worn leather chair, rubbed his temples, and whispered, "Marlowe, if you could see this." On the wall hung a photograph, two young physicists beside a chalkboard covered in fluid dynamics. Both smiled, their eyes bright with reckless hope. It had been taken in 1993, the week before the explosion. That day, they had believed they were close to solving the impossible, the stable unification of turbulent flow under variable compressibility. The missing term had been Marlowe's idea, a temporal derivative buried under nonlinear chaos. But they had pushed too far, too fast. A valve failure, a spark, a moment's inattention, and the lab had erupted. Marlowe died before the alarm stopped ringing. For 30 years, Hensley had carried the silence like penance. He withdrew from conferences, refused interviews, buried the research, and taught only undergraduate courses. Columbia called it voluntary sabbatical. In truth, it was exile. And now, 3 decades later, some unknown mind had finished it. He turned on the lamp, pulled the printed photograph of the rooftop glass closer, and began mapping symbols. The notation was crude, scrawled without ruler or precision, but the logic was flawless. The writer knew turbulence like a language, not as equations memorized, but as poetry breathed. Then his eyes caught the faint trace near the corner, the T written in condensation. He inhaled sharply. That symbol wasn't random. It was deliberate. It was the one piece Marlowe had said would bend time around the flow. Hensley rose, pacing. This can't be coincidence. Someone knows the original formulation. He opened his drawer, took out a yellowed folder labeled Project Phoenix, and spread its contents across the desk. Old blueprints, incomplete equations, and a letter from Marlowe dated 2 days before the accident. If anything happens, promise me you'll never bury the work. Equations don't kill. People do. He closed his eyes. The words cut as sharply now as they had 30 years ago. Across campus, Elias Rowan was mopping the marble floor outside the physics offices, head bowed, earbuds dangling without music. Every sound, the hum of radiators, the click of shoes on tile, felt amplified, dangerous. The news had spread. The mystery formula on the rooftop had become a rumor that rippled through students and faculty alike. Probably a publicity stunt, someone muttered. Or maybe an AI projection, said another. Whoever did it, a third voice laughed, deserves a snowstorm in their face. Elias kept his head down, his mop gliding in slow circles. He didn't speak, didn't look up. He had already deleted the drafts from his phone, burned the leftover notes behind the dorm. But inside his mind, the numbers continued to evolve, multiplying like living things. When he reached the end of the corridor, the door to Hensley's office was slightly ajar. He paused. From within came the sound of chalk on a board, swift, urgent, almost desperate. He couldn't resist. He peered through the gap. Professor Hensley stood before a small blackboard, surrounded by scattered papers. He was redrawing the rooftop equation, whispering to himself as he worked. Incompressible limit. No, that's wrong. Rotate the tensor. Damn it, that's not it either. His hand trembled. He stepped back, sighed, then suddenly froze, as if struck by revelation. Slowly, he wrote a new term, connecting two partial derivatives. Elias recognized it instantly. He's following my structure, he thought. Then, shockingly, the old man made the same mistake Elias had corrected the night before, the wrong sign on the energy dissipation term. Without thinking, Elias whispered, "Negative. It should be negative." The chalk paused mid-air. Hensley turned. "Who's there?" Elias froze, breath caught in his throat. He pushed his mop forward, pretending he hadn't spoken. "Sorry, sir, just maintenance." But the professor's eyes narrowed. "You corrected me," he said softly. "You said negative. Why?" Elias swallowed. I didn't mean to, sir. I was just thinking out loud." Hensley studied him. A thin young man in a faded green uniform, hair damp with sweat, holding a mop like a shield. Something flickered behind those eyes, fear and brilliance, both trying to hide. "What's your name, son?" "Rowan. Elias Rowan." The professor stepped closer. "Rowan, have we met before?" "No, sir." "Are you a student here?" "Not anymore." "Anymore." The word hung in the air like a verdict. Hensley's gaze drifted toward the window, the faint pattern of frost catching morning light. He turned back slowly. "You were on the roof." Elias didn't answer. His throat was too dry. The silence stretched between them, long enough for truth to echo without words. Finally, Elias whispered, "I didn't mean to cause trouble. I just needed somewhere quiet to think." "Quiet?" Hensley said almost bitterly. "That's what I wanted too once." He walked back to the board, hands clasped behind his back. "You solved part of it," he murmured, "but not all. Do you know what it means?" Elias hesitated. "It's about energy decay across variable viscosity. The missing term stabilizes the flow under non-linear collapse." Hensley turned, his expression unreadable. "You do know." The old man's voice softened. "Where did you learn this, Rowan? Whose work did you study?" "No one's," Elias said. "Just the scraps they threw away. Old journals, lecture notes in the trash, equations on walls." The professor's lips trembled. For a moment, he saw not a janitor's son, but the shadow of Marlowe, young, wild, uninvited, defying the world's permission. He said quietly, "You shouldn't be here." Elias nodded. "I know." But as he turned to leave, Hensley added, "Come back tonight, through the back door." Elias stopped mid-step. "Sir? I want to see you finish it. Properly. On a real board." Elias stared at him, unsure whether this was mercy or madness. "Why?" he asked. Hensley smiled faintly. "Because 30 years ago someone gave me that chance, and I failed him." That night the campus was silent again. Snow fell thicker than before, muffling footsteps and sirens. In the lab on the 4th floor, a single lamp glowed against the storm. Elias entered quietly through the maintenance corridor, clothes dusted with snow, hair damp against his forehead. Hensley waited by the blackboard, chalk ready. No words of welcome, only a nod toward the equation. Elias approached, hesitating. For the first time in his life, he stood before a real board in a real laboratory. He raised the chalk, hand trembling slightly, and began to write. The sound was soft, rhythmic, pure. Chalk met slate. Symbols formed. The old man watched, not as a superior but as a witness. For an hour, there was no speech, only the language of motion and meaning. Hensley filled in what Elias could not. Elias corrected what Hensley misremembered. Two eras converged. Snow pressed against the windows like an audience holding its breath. When the final term connected, they both stepped back. On the board stretched the living structure of turbulence, a symphony of motion, perfectly balanced. Hensley's voice broke. "Marlowe, we did it." Elias looked at him, confused. "Who's Marlowe?" The old man didn't answer. He only reached out, placed a trembling hand on the young man's shoulder, and said, "You don't know what you've started." Outside, lightning flashed over the frozen city, illuminating the glass tower. The rooftop equation was alive again, and for the first time, so was he. Morning returned to Columbia like a blade of light cutting through the storm. The snow had stopped, but its silence lingered, the kind that makes every sound too sharp, too human. By 8 o'clock, rumors had already begun. Someone in facilities had seen two figures in the research lab after hours. Someone else swore the lights had stayed on all night. By noon, the dean's secretary had filed a formal report. Unauthorized access, possible breach of research security. In academia, those words carried the weight of accusation and exile. Professor Leonard Hensley sat at his desk when the first email arrived. "Please report to the Ethics Review Board, room 214 at 4 o'clock p.m. He read it twice, then closed his laptop without reply. Across campus, Elias Rowan was sweeping the entryway of the physics building when two campus security officers approached. "Mr. Rowan?" He looked up, broom in hand. "Yes, sir?" "Dean's office wants a word." The words chilled him more than the winter air. He was escorted across the courtyard, the wind biting at his face. Students watched as he passed, some curious, some amused. The janitor's kid being questioned. A spectacle in daylight. When they reached the administration building, one officer said gently, "You're not in trouble yet, son. Just tell the truth." Elias nodded, but truth was the one thing he wasn't sure how to tell. Inside room 214, a half-dozen faculty members sat behind a long oak table, papers stacked neatly before them. At the center was Dean Margaret Lowell, a woman whose voice was as precise as her haircut. Professor Hensley stood near the window, arms crossed, his gaze distant. The dean began, "Mr. Rowan, is it true that you were inside Laboratory 4B last night?" Elias swallowed hard. "Yes, ma'am." "Do you understand that this laboratory houses restricted research?" "Yes." "And that you are not, nor have ever been, enrolled as a student in this department?" "Yes." Her tone hardened. "Then explain why you were there." Elias glanced toward Hensley. The professor's face gave nothing away. No nod, no signal, only a faint exhaustion that told him not to lie. "I went there because I was invited," Elias said quietly. "By whom?" He hesitated. "Professor Hensley." Gasps whispered across the table. The dean turned. "Professor, is this true?" Hensley met her gaze, calm and unflinching. "It is. Would you care to elaborate?" "I asked him to return, to finish something he began." The dean's brows furrowed. "You're suggesting this young man was involved in research. Professor, this is highly irregular." "It's not irregular," Hensley said softly. "It's genius." The room went silent. Dean Lowell leaned forward. "Professor, I understand your admiration for unorthodox thinking, but inviting a maintenance worker into a restricted lab is a direct violation of university policy. You've placed both our institution and your career in jeopardy." Hensley's reply came like a quiet hammer. "Then perhaps our policies are what need revising." A murmur swept through the room. The dean's expression hardened. You realize this could lead to disciplinary action. Yes, said Hensley, but I won't deny what I saw. The equation on that rooftop, it's authentic. It completes the missing term of the Marlowe-Hensley formulation. And he pointed to Elias, wrote it. Every head turned. Elias felt heat crawl up his neck. Sir, please. No, Hensley said firmly. You deserve to be seen. The dean tapped her pen sharply. Let me understand this. You're claiming this young man solved a portion of a decades-old unsolved problem? Yes. And you have proof? I have the board. Her eyes narrowed. Then we'll see it. That afternoon, the entire committee followed Hensley and Elias to Laboratory 4B. The snow outside glowed like crushed glass as sunlight returned to the city. Inside, the air smelled faintly of chalk and ozone. On the blackboard, the equation remained. Sprawling, beautiful, impossible. The professors leaned in, murmuring among themselves. A few recognized patterns immediately. The symmetry, the reformulation of divergence terms. Others frowned, unwilling to believe what their eyes saw. Dean Lowell whispered, Who wrote this? Hensley said, You're looking at him. The dean turned to Elias. Is that true? Elias hesitated. The world seemed to hold its breath. Then, softly, Yes, ma'am. She studied him for a long time, then spoke carefully. Do you even understand what this equation implies? Elias nodded. It implies stability across non-linear turbulence. It means flow can predict its own decay before collapse. It means control. One of the younger professors stepped forward. That's absurd. Those terms contradict the known model. Only if you assume the model's complete, Elias replied. His voice shook, but his words cut clean. Silence fell again. Even the dean looked unsettled. Finally, Hensley said, The equation is sound. I'll stake my name on it. The committee exchanged looks, some skeptical, some terrified, some envious. The dean exhaled. Very well. We'll verify it independently. Until then, both of you are suspended from all research activities. Mr. Rowan, you are to refrain from entering any restricted facilities. Do you understand? Yes, ma'am. Hensley nodded once. Understood. The meeting dispersed in uneasy murmurs. Outside, the wind had picked up again, carrying dry flakes across the quad. Elias followed Hensley into the open air. Why did you tell them? He asked quietly. You could have denied everything. Because the truth deserves a witness, Hensley said. Even if it destroys me. They walked in silence for a while. Past the frozen fountains, past the bronze statue of Hamilton. Then Elias said, They'll never believe it. Not yet, said the old man, but equations have a strange habit of surviving disbelief. That evening, Elias returned to his small room beneath the maintenance wing. The radiator hissed softly. He sat on the floor, staring at his notebook, the last page still empty. He had filled it with brilliance, but now all he felt was fear. He thought of his mother, still sewing uniforms in their apartment, waiting for the call that never came. He thought of what the dean's eyes had said. You don't belong here. He whispered to himself, maybe they're right. Above him, the pipes rattled. Somewhere across the campus, a bell rang. And in a quiet office, Hensley was staring at the same equation, tracing its curves with his trembling hand. He was remembering the explosion again, the blinding flash, the smell of burning copper, the sound of Marlowe shouting his name. For 30 years he had believed he was cursed to watch his life's work rot in silence. But now, this boy had reopened the door. He looked at the formula and whispered, "Not this time." At midnight, an email left Hensley's computer, encrypted, addressed to an old colleague at MIT, subject line, "Proof of continuity in viscous flow." Attached were two images: the rooftop photograph, the completed board. Then he signed it with two names, Rowan Hensley. He sat back in the dark, snow falling beyond the window. For the first time in decades, he smiled. He knew the storm that would come in the morning, the accusations, the disbelief, the committees, the envy. But he also knew this. The equation was alive now, and nothing could unwrite it. Down below, Elias dreamed restlessly, of sunlight on glass, of formulas burning gold, of voices whispering his name in disbelief. The world had started to look up at the rooftop again, and somewhere between genius and exile, the investigation had begun. The campus looked different at night now, not quieter, but watchful. Rumors had turned into stories, and stories into a quiet kind of fear. Students spoke in whispers about the rooftop equation, about the janitor's son who had solved a ghost problem, and the old professor who had lost his mind to believe it. The administration called it a disciplinary matter. But to Elias Rowan and Leonard Hensley, it had become something else entirely: a secret war between truth and permission. Snow dusted the glass towers of Columbia like a veil of secrecy. The research building stood half-lit, its windows throwing pale squares of light into the storm. Inside, the lab was cold, empty, and forbidden. Yet two figures stood within, one young, one old, both silent as they watched the reflection of themselves in the great window wall, the mirror between worlds. It had been 2 days since the inquiry. The board had sealed the lab, suspended Hensley, and revoked Elias's access to the building, but the janitor's master key still worked. "Close the blinds," Elias whispered. Hensley shook his head. "No. Let the night see us." He flicked the switch. Fluorescent light flooded the lab, casting their reflections onto the glass. Two shadows among equations. Outside, the city blinked like a patient heart monitor. The air smelled faintly of chalk and ozone. The board stood ready. "Are you sure?" Elias asked. "If they find us here again—" "They will," Hensley said calmly. "But by then it won't matter." The old man picked up a piece of chalk. His hands trembled less now. "I've spent my life waiting for permission to continue. You taught me how useless that is." He began to write. At first, their collaboration was slow, awkward, like two musicians learning the rhythm of each other's silence. Elias spoke in bursts, his ideas fast and unpolished. Hensley countered with structure, discipline, and the weight of history. The chalk squeaked, erased, rewrote, whispered against slate. They were not equals, yet they met as mirrors, one reflecting the future, the other the past. For hours they wrote in the mirror room, the giant window casting back their own movements. To anyone watching from the street below, it looked like ghosts writing on air. "Your correction to the inertial term," Hensley said, stepping back, "it changes everything. The solution's not purely physical anymore. It's temporal." Elias nodded. "That's what I've been trying to say. It's like the flow remembers where it came from." "Memory in turbulence," Hensley murmured, "a hysteresis of energy decay." He smiled faintly. "Marlowe would have loved that." Elias looked at him. "He was your partner?" Hensley hesitated, then nodded. "My friend, the best I ever had. We were both young, too proud, too certain the world would forgive our mistakes." He glanced at the window. It didn't. Elias didn't press. He simply turned back to the board, adding the next line of symbols. The professor watched him, marveling at how effortlessly the young man moved between chaos and order. It was like watching a pianist play in a language only the soul could read. "You're not solving it," Hensley said softly. "You're listening to it." Elias smiled faintly. "Equations talk. Most people just don't stay quiet long enough to hear." At 3 in the morning, they stopped. The equation had grown enormous, a cathedral of logic sprawling across 3 boards, dense but perfectly symmetrical. Outside, the first edge of dawn brushed the skyline. Elias slumped into a chair, exhausted. "If this is right, it means fluid motion isn't random at all. It follows a hidden conservation of memory." "Yes," Hensley said, eyes bright. "You've built the bridge between determinism and chaos." He turned toward the window, where their reflections hovered side by side. In the glass, Elias looked almost like the man Hensley once was, younger, bolder, untouched by defeat. And Hensley looked like the man Elias might one day become, older, tempered, haunted by brilliance. 2 reflections facing each other through the mirror. Then, without warning, the door handle rattled. Elias shot up. Hensley killed the lights. They froze, listening. Footsteps. Voices. The sound of a key turning. The door opened halfway, a security guard's flashlight slicing through the dark. "Hello? Anyone in here?" No answer. The beam scanned the lab, gliding over tables, microscopes, scattered papers. It paused for a moment on the chalkboard, a glimpse of impossible mathematics glimmering faintly in the starlight. Then it moved on. The door closed. They waited until the echo vanished, hearts pounding. Elias exhaled. "That was close." Hensley chuckled quietly. "You're learning the first rule of discovery, my boy." "What's that?" He smiled. "Truth always sounds like trespassing at first." Later, as the city stirred awake, Elias stood by the glass wall, staring at the faint reflection of their completed work. Behind him, Hensley sorted papers, humming softly, a melody half-remembered from a life before loss. "Do you ever regret it?" Elias asked suddenly. "What?" "Coming back. Facing all this again." Hensley didn't answer at once. "Regret is a form of cowardice," he said finally. "It's the mind refusing to forgive its own courage." He joined Elias by the window. Together they looked out across the city, the river glinting in pale light, the rooftops whispering under frost. "I used to believe the world needed gatekeepers," Hensley said, "people who guarded truth until others were ready for it. But maybe it's the gatekeepers who keep us all in the dark." Elias turned to him. "So what do we do now?" "Now," Hensley said, "we make sure the light can't be turned off." He pulled a small flash drive from his pocket and handed it over. "This is the data, the full derivation. Upload it anonymously. Let the world see before they bury us." Elias hesitated. "They'll trace it." "They will," Hensley said, eyes soft. "But if the truth belongs to no one, they can't destroy it." The young man took the drive, staring at the small piece of metal as if it weighed the world. Then he said quietly, "If this gets out, they'll fire you." Hensley smiled. "They already have." At dawn, they left the lab. Outside, the sky had begun to blush with gold, the same hue that had once burned on the rooftop glass. They stood together on the steps of Hamilton Hall, snow crunching beneath their boots. Elias asked, "Do you think they'll ever believe it came from me?" Hensley looked toward the rising sun. "No, not at first. They'll mock it, dismiss it, try to claim it as their own. But one day, they'll realize that truth doesn't ask for a name." He paused. That's when you'll have to decide what kind of man you want to be. The one who hides behind brilliance, or the one who pays the price for it. Elias stared at the flash drive, then slipped it into his pocket. I already decided, he said. They parted ways, the old man walking back toward his small faculty apartment, the young man disappearing into the city's waking breath. Through the window of Laboratory 4B, the equations still shimmered faintly, gold where sunlight met chalk dust. Two reflections stood frozen in the glass, a boy and an old man, bound forever by what they had dared to write. The mirror room kept their secret, for now. The world discovered it before Columbia did. At 3:42 a.m., a research blog in Zurich uploaded an anonymous post titled The Rooftop Equation, a possible continuity solution to Navier-Stokes. By sunrise, it had been translated, shared, mocked, worshipped, and downloaded thousands of times. The post carried no name, only two initials at the bottom, R.H. No one knew who had written it. But every physicist who opened the file understood one thing immediately. It was either madness or a miracle. By morning, chaos rippled across the academic world. In Cambridge, a professor at MIT called his colleagues into the hallway. It's impossible, he whispered, and yet the math works. In Paris, a fluid dynamics lab canceled all lectures for the day. In Kyoto, graduate students gathered around a whiteboard, tracing the symmetry that shouldn't exist. And in New York, Columbia University's inboxes exploded. Dean Margaret Lowell was among the first to receive the alert. The anonymous upload had used fragments of the university's internal server. Her first reaction was disbelief. Her second was fury. She stormed into the physics building, hair still damp from snow. Who leaked this? She demanded. And why does it carry this university's watermark? No one answered. By noon, the campus looked like a hive disturbed. Students whispered in hallways. Journalists began calling the press office. Security patrolled the labs. And in the middle of it all, Professor Hensley sat calmly at his desk, sipping cold coffee, reading the very post he had sent. He smiled faintly. So, he murmured, the world still listens. Meanwhile, in the maintenance corridor below Hamilton Hall, Elias Rowan was pushing his mop when his phone began to vibrate non-stop. Notifications flooded the cracked screen. Rooftop equation goes viral. Unsolved problem breakthrough. Anonymous submission shocks academia. He froze, the mop handle slick in his hands. His heart pounded. It was out. The equation they had written together, their rebellion in chalk, had escaped the glass and entered the world. He stepped into the supply closet, locked the door, and scrolled through the article. Each line of text was his handwriting, digitized. Each annotation, the same correction he'd whispered on that rooftop. Then he saw the signature. R.H. Rowan Hensley. He sank to the floor. Half laughter, half disbelief. They'd done it. And yet deep down a shadow stirred. The same shadow that had followed him since childhood. The fear that what he built could be taken from him once more. By afternoon, the university called an emergency press conference. Cameras lined the marble hall. Dean Lowell stood before the podium, flanked by professors whose expressions flickered between pride and panic. Our institution is currently investigating the origins of a document circulating online under the title, The Rooftop Equation, she said. While it appears to contain elements of research once conducted here at Columbia, no official authorization was granted for its release. We urge the public to exercise caution until the validity of this material is confirmed. Behind her, flashes lit the room. Reporters shouted questions. Is it true the file came from Professor Hensley's department? Who is the mysterious R in the signature? Is it connected to the janitor's son the faculty suspended last week? Lowell stiffened. That rumor is unfounded. But the tremor in her voice betrayed her. The next morning's headlines were merciless. Columbia cover-up, rooftop equation linked to janitor's son. Old professor, lost formula, and a genius nobody saw. By noon, students gathered outside Hamilton Hall holding handmade signs. Let him speak. Knowledge belongs to everyone. Who owns the truth? Dean Lowell ordered campus security to disperse them, but the chant carried through the frozen air. Inside his apartment, Hensley watched the protests from the window, the snow reflecting their handmade slogans. His phone rang constantly. Colleagues from Princeton, Stanford, even NASA calling for interviews. He ignored them all. Instead, he opened his laptop and read through the growing list of online analyses. Physicists were already calling it a paradigm shift. The math held. It was real. And yet, what filled him was not triumph, but a terrible peace. He thought of Marlowe again, of the day the experiment exploded, and how he had stood over the ashes, whispering that truth should never cost a life. Now it had cost another, a boy's anonymity, perhaps even his future. He picked up the phone and dialed Elias. The call came as Elias was eating lunch alone in the cafeteria, his phone buzzing against the tray. "Professor," he said softly. "Elias, we need to talk. I saw the post. It's everywhere." "I know. They're saying it's a hoax. It won't be for long." Silence stretched between them, the kind that carries both fear and understanding. "Do you regret it?" Elias asked. "No," Hensley said. "Do you?" Elias hesitated. "I don't know. It's beautiful, but it's like watching your heart get dissected by strangers." Hensley's voice softened. "That's what discovery feels like." There was a pause. Then the professor said quietly, "They're calling me to testify tomorrow. You should stay away from campus tonight." "Why?" "They'll come for you next." That night, Columbia University shone under floodlights as if on trial before the city. The police had arrived, not for crime but for order. Journalists camped outside the gates, breath misting in the freezing air. Elias watched from across the street, hidden beneath the shadow of the chapel. He saw Hensley leave the building, escorted by 2 officers, not handcuffed but surrounded, his face solemn yet unbroken. He wanted to run to him, to speak, to explain. But something in Hensley's eyes stopped him. The professor looked up once, scanning the crowd, and for the briefest second, their eyes met. A faint smile crossed the old man's lips. Then, he was gone. By midnight, Elias was back on the rooftop, the place where it had all begun. The glass pane was still there, streaked with frost, faint traces of gold dust from the first morning clinging to its edges. He touched it gently, fingers numb. His reflection stared back. The same boy who had once written defiance on the sky. "I didn't mean for it to go this far," he whispered. His breath fogged the glass, and for an instant, the fog formed symbols again. Ghostly echoes of the equation, fading as quickly as they appeared. He sank to his knees, snow gathering on his shoulders, the city lights blurring below him. Somewhere in the distance, sirens wailed. Not for him, not yet, but moving closer. He thought of Hensley's voice, calm and certain. Truth always sounds like trespassing at first. He whispered to the wind, "Then let them hear me trespass." By dawn, The equation had spread to every corner of the internet. Forums, podcasts, and research journals debated it endlessly. Some called it plagiarism, some called it genius, others simply called it proof. But no matter what they called it, the world had changed. In Cambridge, an MIT professor wrote, "For the first time in decades, I believe turbulence may have a conscience." In Zurich, a graduate student stayed up 40 hours straight, deriving extensions. In NASA's propulsion division, engineers quietly began recalculating fluid models based on the leaked formula. And in a small janitor's room beneath Columbia, a boy folded his last notebook shut and whispered, "It's out of our hands now." That same morning, on the front page of the New York Times, a single line appeared beneath a photograph of the university gates. When the morning sun hit the glass, his equation burned gold and changed everything. Elias read it once, smiled through tears, and closed the paper. He knew the storm was far from over, but for the first time the world had spoken his language. News travels faster than proof. By the end of the week, belief had hardened into camps, and camps into tribunals. In the halls where whispers once tiptoed, voices now marched. Tenured certainty put on its robe, curiosity put on a brave face. And somewhere between them, a young man folded a mop and waited for the verdict of people who had never learned to listen to glass. Columbia announced the hearing with the kind of ceremonial phrasing reserved for old buildings and new scandals. A special session of the Research Integrity Council. Invitations were extended, attendance was limited, but the campus knew. Students clustered on the steps, their signs damp with sleet. Cameras lined the walk like winter shrubs in bright metal bloom. The city, too, seemed to lean closer, as if a court of stone and steam had convened to judge the air itself. Elias Rowan arrived without a lawyer. He wore the same green work jacket he had patched by hand, the same boots that had memorized every corridor. A security officer guided him past the crowd, and for a moment he saw his reflection in the administration building's doors. Two versions of himself superimposed, the boy who cleaned the floors and the boy who wrote on the sky. He swallowed, nodded to no one, and stepped inside. The council chamber smelled faintly of old polish and new paper. At a long table sat the members, faces he knew as portraits in corridors. At their center, Dean Margaret Lowell stacked files into a careful, theatrical tower. To her right, 3 faculty from physics and applied math. To her left, legal counsel, eyes like sealed envelopes. At the far end, alone, sat Professor Leonard Hensley, his hands folded, his eyelids heavy with unslept hours. "Mr. Rowan," the dean began, voice even, "you are here as a witness. You are not under investigation." A beat. For now. He inclined his head. "Yes, ma'am." The doors opened again. The room shifted imperceptibly like a tide turning. A tall young man entered in a tailored coat the color of wet slate. Nathaniel Pierce, doctoral candidate, son of the Pierce Foundation, benefactor of 2 laboratories and 1 lecture series on the ethics of discovery. His shoes whispered against the carpet. He took his seat beside counsel, removed a pair of thin leather gloves, and arranged his smile. "Mr. Pierce," the dean said, "you requested to make a statement." Nathaniel looked briefly at the cameras, then at Elias with a cultivated pity. "Thank you, Dean Lowell. Colleagues, I have come to correct a misunderstanding." The document known as the Rooftop Equation, a tragic mislabeling in my view, was not the product of vandalism or happenstance. It was the draft of a research direction I have pursued for 2 years under Columbia's banner. Early fragments of it were compromised, posted without authorization. He let the word compromised breathe. "I do not seek spectacle. I seek restoration." The dean's pen paused above her notes. "And how," she asked, "do you connect this claim to the anonymous file marked RH?" Nathaniel's smile thinned. "Initials can be forged, servers can be spoofed, symbols can be copied by those who work near them." Every head turned, as if pulled by a single wire, toward the young man in the green jacket. Elias felt the room tilt. 1,000 nights of quiet learning narrowed to the width of an accusation. He looked at Hensley. The professor met his eyes with a slow, weary calm, then rose. "Dean Lowell," Hensley said, voice almost conversational, "if we intend to weigh truth today, we must allow it to speak plainly." He took a sheet of paper from his coat pocket, a printed email, corners softened by his hands. "This is the submission I sent at midnight 2 nights ago, signed as Rowan Hensley. The derivation is his. The history is mine. I leaked it. If punishment is required, it belongs here." He touched his chest gently, as though it were an address. The room inhaled. Counsel exchanged murmurs. The dean's tower of files leaned a fraction, then steadied. Nathaniel laughed, polite, incredulous. "With respect, Professor, this is sentimental theater. We have lab notebooks dated. We have partial drafts that—" "Partial," Hensley said, not unkindly. "Yes. That's the word. You have fragments of roads that lead nowhere." He turned to the board behind them, where someone had copied a portion of the posted formula. "The signature of this solution is a negative sign most of us corrected away in youth. It sits where pride refuses to. It sits where memory governs decay. Mr. Pierce, please tell us why you changed it to positive." A flush rose to Nathaniel's cheeks, the first color of the morning that was not institutional gray. It's obvious in the compressible limit," he said quickly, "which any graduate student would assume," Hensley finished, "as I did 30 years ago, as you did last month." He faced the council. "Your candidate is bright. He has a grasp of the instruments and the language of power, but this solution came from a quieter place. A place that knows failure as part of the grammar. I did not teach that to Mr. Pierce." He looked at Elias. "But the world taught it to Mr. Rowan." Silence cracked. The room's temperature seemed to drop. The dean's eyes narrowed in the polite way of someone measuring cost. "Professor, your confession complicates an already delicate matter. Donors are concerned. The public is watching. And Mr. Pierce's materials, imperfect as you argue, predate this rooftop phenomenon." "Dates," Hensley said, "are not the same as origins." The counsel cleared his throat. "Let us be specific. Mr. Rowan, did you at any time remove research documents from Laboratory 4B? Elias stood. His voice landed softer than he wished, but it did not shake. "No." "Did you enter the lab without authorization?" "Yes." Dean Lowell lifted a brow. "Why?" "Because the door was locked," he said simply. "Because the board was inside and the window was outside. Because the air on the roof was the only room I had." He glanced once at Nathaniel. "And because sometimes the truth belongs where everyone can see it, not where only some can touch it." A murmur rippled through the back row. A professor who had not spoken yet looked down at her hands. Nathaniel's smile returned, colder. "Poetry is not proof," he said. "Equations are. My notes show a near-identical structure." "Near-identical," Hensley said again. He walked to the board, chalk in hand, and circled 2 terms at the edge. A small correction, a hinge the size of a breath. "Here," he said, "is the difference between an idea and a life. Mr. Pierce moves energy forward as if time were a ladder. Mr. Rowan lets it fold back on itself as if time could remember." He placed the chalk on the tray and looked tired enough to vanish. Dean Lowell tapped the table lightly. "We will recess," she said. 1 hour. The council filed out. Cameras whispered. Doors closed. The room exhaled. Elias sat. His hands found the seam in his jacket he had sewn the night before and followed it stitch by stitch, as if reading a sentence he could trust. Across the aisle, Nathaniel approached, the leather of his gloves breathing quietly. "You're out of your depth," Nathaniel said, not unkindly, more like a man explaining weather. "There are ways things are done here. You put your name on a world that will not carry you." Elias looked up. "I put sunlight on a window." Nathaniel considered him, then shrugged, a gesture practiced in mirrors. "You will learn, or you will leave." He turned away, but not before his eyes flicked toward the camera crew adjusting lenses at the back. He was measuring angles. Elias felt it like a draft across his face. A chair creaked. Hensley lowered himself beside the young man. Up close, the professor looked like Winter. Spare, essential, honest. "They'll split us," Elias said quietly. "They'll try. You'll lose your pension." "I already spent it," Hensley said, and almost smiled. "On years of silence." A pause gathered between them, soft as falling ash. "Why me?" Elias asked. "You could have given this to any of your protégés." "To him." He nodded at Nathaniel's sharp silhouette. "Anyone with a badge." Hensley's gaze wandered to the window, where the city showed itself in shards, a river the color of steel, a sky layered like an argument. "Because you kept the sign negative," he said. "Because you rode in cold until the glass burned. Because when the door was locked, you did not ask for a key, you climbed." The hour ended. The council returned. Verdicts in universities seldom arrive as thunder. They seep like thaw. Dean Lowell spoke of process, of further review, of interim measures. She announced a formal authorship investigation. She reinstated Hensley's access pending cooperation. She placed Elias on administrative restriction. No labs, no rooftop access, no presence after hours, for his safety. Her mouth shaping the phrase as if tasting it for poison. And then came the sentence that changed the weather of the hall. Until authorship is resolved, the university recognizes Mr. Nathaniel Pierce as the provisional lead on the continuity model now under external review. The word provisional rang like a mercy that had misplaced its address. Hensley closed his eyes. Elias felt the air thin. Outside, the crowd's noise surged as the doors opened. Reporters leaned toward the dean. Microphones congregated like crows. Nathaniel found the nearest camera as if it had found him. He spoke of rigor, of collaboration, of regret for security lapses. He did not say the word rooftop. He did not need to. Elias slipped past the cluster and into the cold. Snow, half rain now, ticked on his cheeks. He walked without aim until the buildings thinned and the river answered his breath with its own. He found the end of a pier where ice dreamed in slush, and the city made a low music of sirens and gulls. He thought of the first dawn, of gold on glass, of the quiet certainty that he had written something true. He thought of how truth, placed under lights, becomes theater for those who can afford tickets. Footsteps on wood. He did not turn. Hensley stood beside him, breathing carefully, as if not to disturb a sleeping idea. "They took it," Elias said. "They borrowed it," Hensley answered. "The difference is time. They'll publish first. They'll publish louder." Elias laughed once, without mirth. "That helps." "It will," Hensley said, "if we decide who we are before they decide what we are." He reached into his coat and offered a folded page. Marlowe's letter. I should have given you this sooner. Elias opened it. The paper crackled like thin ice. The handwriting was impatient, exact. If anything happens, promise me you'll never bury the work. Equations don't kill. People do. Under it, a line in another hand, Hensley's ink, more careful. Forgive me. 30 years, the professor said, looking at the water. I have been asking the wrong permission. Elias folded the letter and placed it inside his jacket, near the seam he trusted. What do we do now? Hensley's eyes went to the skyline, to the tall plane of the lab's window catching late light. We go back to the mirror room tonight. They sealed it. Windows aren't doors, he said gently. They don't know how to keep out light. Elias nodded. The decision settled in him like a stone warmed by hands. Behind them, the campus bell began a long, deliberate tolling, official, slow, almost kind. The day leaned toward evening. The river made a promise no one heard. They walked back together, past the statues and the carved names, past the cameras packing up their hunger, past the students handing one another candles in paper cups that trembled in the wind. On the steps, someone had chalked a sentence Elias did not stop to read. Who owns the morning? In the glass of Hamilton Hall, the city arranged them into a single figure, old shoulders, young stride, moving toward a pane that had once held gold. Somewhere above, a storm was rehearsing. Somewhere within, a board waited like an altar. The reckoning had handed down its grammar. Now they would answer with a sentence of their own. Night fell like an argument the world had grown too tired to finish. The snow had ended, leaving behind a glassy crust that reflected every streetlight as if the city were made of broken stars. Inside Hamilton Hall, the doors were locked, alarms armed, and yet somewhere on the upper floors, two shadows moved in silence, one old, one young, both chasing something they could no longer hide from. Elias Rowan followed Professor Hensley up the dim back stairwell, each step echoing like a heartbeat. The professor carried a small lantern instead of a phone. Its circle of light trembled across the walls, brushing the warning signs. Authorized personnel only, restricted access, level 4B. At the final landing, Hensley stopped. His hand rested on the door that led to the mirror room. They changed the locks again, Elias whispered. The old man smiled faintly. Locks only keep out those who believe in them. He knelt, produced a narrow metal tool from his coat pocket, older than the alarm system itself, and with a click, the door yielded. The stale air inside tasted of chalk dust and memory. The boards stood untouched, but the equations that had once shimmered there had been wiped clean. Only faint traces remained, like the shadow of handwriting burned onto glass by light. Elias stepped forward. They erased it. No, Hensley said softly. They tried to. The moment we wrote it, it left here. He touched the wall where the first term had once begun. But the truth keeps its fingerprints. They stood facing the empty board. Then, without speaking, Elias began to write again. Not the full equation this time, but the story behind it. Words, not symbols. I climbed because the door was locked. I wrote because silence is another form of theft. If knowledge belongs to anyone, it belongs to those who need it most. When he finished, he dropped the chalk and turned. They'll destroy us for this. Hensley nodded. Then let's make it worth the destruction. By dawn, the mirror room gleamed faintly in the half-light. On the glass window facing the city, they had written their last message in soot and condensation. Equations don't belong to universities. They belong to the wind. Hensley's voice trembled as he said, It's time. Elias frowned. Time for what? Confession, the professor whispered. The one the world never heard. That morning, the press gathered again on the steps of the administration building. Rumor had turned to frenzy. Leaks of internal memos, whispers of plagiarism, anonymous threats. Cameras waited like predators in the snow. At precisely 9 o'clock, Leonard Hensley appeared at the top of the marble stairs, coat buttoned, eyes steady. No security guard escorted him. No university statement preceded him. Only the brittle sound of a man who had finally stopped running from silence. Reporters surged forward. Professor Hensley, are you responsible for the data breach? Did you falsify authorship? Where is Elias Rowan? He raised a hand, and somehow the noise fell away. I will speak, he said, voice carrying through the cold air. And then I will answer. He stepped to the microphone, took off his gloves, and unfolded a piece of paper, handwritten, the ink uneven. 30 years ago, a man named Irving Marlowe died because I believed control mattered more than compassion. We tried to tame turbulence and lost everything to it. For decades, I buried our work. I thought I was protecting others. In truth, I was protecting my pride. He looked up. 2 months ago, I saw an equation written on the rooftop glass of this university. It was mine and not mine, born of the same ghost but spoken in a new language. The boy who wrote it had no key, no clearance, no family name, and no right, according to your rules, to touch what was mine. Yet he understood it better than I ever did. His name is Elias Rowan, and if you seek the author, seek him. The courtyard was silent except for shutters clicking like nervous hearts. He is the child of a janitor. He learned calculus by scrubbing floors that bore other people's theorems. He solved what the rest of us called unsolvable because no one ever told him he couldn't. He folded the paper, placed it in his pocket. If there is punishment, let it come to me. I leaked the paper. I defied your policy. I chose the rooftop over the boardroom. Because I have spent half my life guarding a door that never needed guarding. Dean Lowell pushed through the crowd, pale with disbelief. Professor, stop this. He shook his head gently. No, Dean, you can't stop what already left the glass. Then he stepped down the stairs, surrendering not to guards but to gravity, to the inevitable pull of consequence. The crowd parted. Cameras followed him until he disappeared through the administrative doors. Elias watched from across the quad, hidden beneath the branches of an elm tree. Every word had felt like a blow and a benediction at once. He wanted to run forward, to thank him, to tell him it wasn't his fault. But the guards closed the doors, and the moment was sealed like wax. That night, the news ran everywhere. Confession at Columbia. Professor claims responsibility. Commentators debated his sanity. Students lit candles on the steps. Someone painted on the snow-white statue of Hamilton, "Truth has no clearance." Elias couldn't sleep. He sat on the edge of his narrow bed, Hensley's letter spread open on his lap. If anything happens, promise me you'll never bury the work. He looked at the flash drive still in his pocket, their backup. On it were not just equations, but notes, derivations, and a short video of the two of them working in the mirror room. Evidence, proof, memory. He whispered to the empty room, "You didn't bury it, neither will I." The next morning, he walked into the journalism building across campus. The receptionist recognized him instantly. The boy from the photos, the rooftop ghost. He asked for one thing: access to the live stream. She hesitated, then nodded. Minutes later, the feed went live. A quiet broadcast, unscheduled, unfiltered. No university logo. Just Elias sitting before a camera, snowlight behind him, voice steady. "My name is Elias Rowan," he began. "You've heard many stories about me. Most of them are wrong." He told them everything, not to plead innocence but to reclaim truth from rumor. How he had learned at night through discarded textbooks, how he'd climbed the rooftop because the door was locked, how Professor Hensley had found him and seen, not trespass, but pattern. He ended simply, "We didn't break into a lab. We broke into silence, and if that's a crime, I'll commit it again." He unplugged the microphone, walked out into the falling snow, and vanished down Amsterdam Avenue. Behind him, the live stream spread like wildfire. By evening, protests flared again, larger than before. Students from MIT, Princeton, Caltech, and Cambridge joined online, posting the same words under the tag #Rooftop Equation. Knowledge is not theft. Memes turned equations into poetry. Musicians wrote songs. Scientists argued, then wrote papers. The university, overwhelmed, announced an emergency review to reconsider policies regarding open access and research inclusion. No one mentioned punishment again. That night, Elias returned once more to the rooftop, the place that had been both exile and altar. The snow was fresh, the air raw. He looked toward the glass wall, now dark, reflecting only his face. He raised his hand, traced a final line in the frost. Not an equation, not even a word, just the shape of a circle. Beginning, end, return. Down in the city, the church bells began to ring. Somewhere across the river, reporters still spoke his name. But here, above them all, there was only wind, whispering through steel and silence, carrying the faint gold memory of what had once burned on this very glass. He closed his eyes and whispered, "We finished it, Professor. The rest is theirs." And when the morning sun hit the glass again, for just a heartbeat, the frost flared gold, as if the equation were still there, alive, writing itself across the sky. The wind off the Hudson carried the taste of salt and iron, a whisper of faraway storms. Columbia's towers shimmered beneath a thin veil of rain, their windows like unblinking eyes watching a city that could not decide whether to remember or forget. Inside the faculty building, Professor Leonard Hensley sat alone. The room smelled faintly of dust and chalk, the kind of scent that outlives its owners. Before him lay a half-written letter, the pen resting across the fold. He had spent the last 2 days suspended from duty, summoned and dismissed in equal measure. The university had accepted his confession but refused to absolve him. "Pending review," they had said, as though mercy were a bureaucratic form. He looked at the wall where Marlowe's photograph once hung. The nail was still there, empty. For 30 years, he had thought of that emptiness as punishment. Now he saw it for what it was, invitation. He turned on the desk lamp, drew the letter closer, and wrote, "Elias, they will not understand us. That was never their duty. But someday, perhaps, someone will read the glass as we did and find the courage to climb. Equations are not answers, eh? They are promises we make to the unknown. You kept yours, LH." He folded the page carefully, placed it inside an envelope marked for ER, and sealed it with the edge of his thumbnail. Then he looked out the window. The rain had turned to sleet. The streets glistened like solder lines on a dark circuit board. He whispered, "Time to end the silence." Across the campus, Elias Rowan stood before the mirror room door. He had come back one last time, not to write, but to remember. The hallway lights flickered weakly, their hum mingling with the faraway sound of protest chants still echoing beyond the gates. He reached for the handle. It was locked now, welded shut with a steel bracket. A paper notice hung crookedly over it. Facility under investigation. He smiled, faintly. "You can lock doors," he said, "but not mornings." Then he climbed the maintenance ladder beside the stairwell, the same route he had taken that first night, to the rooftop. The wind bit hard, pulling at his coat. Below him, New York glowed with restless light, the city's heartbeat thudding through its veins of traffic. He knelt near the glass where everything had begun. The soot from his last message had washed away, leaving only a faint residue, invisible unless you knew how to look. He whispered to the sky, "We wrote the truth. Isn't that enough?" Somewhere behind him, the door opened with a groan. Hensley stepped onto the roof, his coat whipping in the wind. "I thought I'd find you here," he said. Elias turned, startled. "Professor, they said you'd been dismissed." "I dismissed myself," Hensley replied. "There's a difference." He walked closer, his cane tapping lightly against the concrete. "They're going to shut it all down. The investigation, the protests, the grant funding. They'll call it closure." "Closure for what?" "For daring," Hensley said simply. He looked at the young man before him, the trembling hands, the frost clinging to his hair, the quiet defiance that had once been his own. "They'll erase our names, Elias. But they can't erase what's been learned. It's already out there, translated, debated, alive." Elias's voice was barely audible above the wind. "Then why does it feel like losing?" "Because truth always costs more than you think you can pay." The old man reached into his coat and took out the letter. "I wrote you something." Elias hesitated before taking it. "What is it?" "Closure," Hensley said again, and this time his smile was tender. "For me." Lightning flashed far across the river. For a heartbeat, their reflections appeared on the glass wall, two figures outlined in gold, one fading, one just beginning. The wind intensified, a raw, circular howl that bent the rain sideways. Hensley stepped closer to the edge, his eyes fixed on the skyline. "Do you know what I realized, Elias? The greatest equation we ever solve isn't written in numbers. It's written in forgiveness." Elias reached for him. "Professor, come back. You're too close." But the wind answered first, a violent surge that lifted a sheet of ice from the ledge and shattered it against the railing. Hensley staggered, caught himself, and laughed softly, a sound that was both surrender and peace. "I've spent my life chasing stability," he said. "But maybe turbulence was the point all along." "Don't." Hensley turned, his eyes clear. "The world needed someone to finish the equation. You did. Now let me finish mine." He pressed a small metal key into Elias's hand, the old maintenance key that had opened every forbidden door. "Keep climbing," he said. Then, before Elias could move, before the sky could blink, the professor stepped forward into the rain and was gone. The moment stretched into silence. No scream, no siren, only the wind carrying the echo of his final words. "Keep climbing." Elias fell to his knees, the key clutched so tightly it cut into his palm. Rain blurred his vision, and for a long time he could not tell whether he was crying or simply dissolving into the storm. Below, the city's lights continued to pulse, indifferent, eternal. He rose slowly, walked to the glass wall, and placed his hand where their reflections had been. The surface was freezing, smooth, unyielding. Yet beneath his touch, the faint pattern of their erased equations seemed to reappear, not in chalk, not in gold, but in memory. He whispered, "You didn't fall, Professor. You just entered the flow." The sleet softened to snow. The world quieted. 3 days later, the university announced the accident in measured tones. Professor Leonard Hensley, esteemed member of the Department of Physics, passed away in an unforeseen incident. His legacy will continue through future research initiatives. There was no mention of the rooftop, no mention of Elias Rowan. But on forums and in journals across the world, tributes poured in. Researchers cited the Hensley-Rowan equation with reverence. MIT proposed naming its new computational fluid lab after him. And at Columbia, someone, no one ever found out who, placed a single line of gold paint on the rooftop glass. Just one. When the morning sun hit it, the reflection burned across the campus like memory refusing to fade. That evening, Elias attended the quiet memorial at the faculty courtyard. Snow muffled every footstep. The crowd was small, a few students, a few staff, and Dean Lowell, her eyes less certain now. After the speeches, Elias stayed behind. The candles flickered in the cold air, their flames bending toward the same direction, the wind off the river. He took the letter from his pocket, opened it with trembling hands, and read by candlelight. Equations are not answers. They are promises we make to the unknown. You kept yours. Keep climbing. He folded the page and slipped it inside his coat. For the first time in days, he breathed without shaking. Then he turned toward the building, its windows glowing faintly like mirrors remembering light, and whispered, "Goodbye, Professor. You finished your equation." He walked away into the falling snow, the key still in his pocket, the skyline still burning gold in the distance. A year passed like a long exhale. Winter returned to New York not as punishment, but as memory. Softer, quieter, carrying the same slow rhythm of snow against stone. The towers of Columbia stood the same, but nothing beneath them was unchanged. Students walked differently now. The locked doors had new signs. Open Access Research Lab. All welcome after hours. The mirror room had been renamed the Hensley Pavilion, and on its rooftop, encased in glass, the faint golden residue of an old equation still glimmered when dawn reached across the Hudson. Elias Rowan walked through the campus gates for the first time in 12 months. He had grown older in ways that time alone could not measure. There was a calm in his gait now, the calm of someone who had seen what truth costs, and chosen to keep paying. His coat was newer, but the same color. In his pocket, the maintenance key still pressed lightly against his palm, like a heartbeat reminding him of who he had been. He passed students laughing on the quad, their laptops bright with formulas and papers tagged RH formulation. He heard his name whispered once or twice, though no one quite knew if it belonged to the myth or the man. He smiled faintly. That was enough. He stopped at the bronze plaque outside Hamilton Hall. The engraving was simple. The rooftop equation. When the morning sun hit the glass, his equation burned gold and changed everything. Dedicated to Professor Leonard Hensley, 1947 to 2025, who believed that knowledge should never need permission. Someone had left a small flower beside it, white hyacinth, Hensley's favorite. Its petals were frozen, yet it seemed to lean toward the sunlight anyway. Inside the building, the walls were lined with framed photos from the year past. Journalists' headlines, student rallies, the letter from MIT announcing the establishment of the Hensley-Rowan Fellowship for Independent Research. It was open to any student in the world who lacked institutional access but carried the spark of unrecognized genius. Applications had flooded in from over 60 countries. Children from villages, factory workers, janitors, street musicians, all daring to write on their own glass. Elias paused in front of a photograph from the memorial. He saw himself there, the boy no one had noticed, standing beside a casket draped in white equations. The caption read, "He taught us that silence is not humility, it's erasure." He closed his eyes. The ache returned, not as grief now, but as gravity, the kind that keeps you anchored to what matters. Dean Margaret Lowell found him there. Her hair had gone slightly gray at the edges. The severity in her voice was gone, too. "I thought you might come back," she said. "I wasn't sure I could." "Neither was I," she admitted. "But it seems you were right. Doors should never have locks." She handed him a thin folder. Inside was a single document, a faculty offer letter. Visiting lecturer in applied mathematics, it read. To teach one seminar, Equations as Language, The Ethics of Discovery. Elias blinked. "You're offering me a position?" She smiled faintly. "I'm offering you a key, the same way Hensley once offered you his." He looked at her, unsure how to speak. She nodded toward the window. "Go on. He'd want you to see it." The elevator hummed as it rose toward the top floor. The doors opened to the mirror room, now a cathedral of glass and quiet. The boards had been cleaned, but above them, engraved in faint gold script, was the final line Hensley had written before his death. "Equations are promises we make to the unknown." Elias approached slowly. His reflection met him halfway, the same eyes, a year wiser. He reached into his pocket, pulled out the folded letter Hensley had left him, and set it gently beneath the engraving. "Your equation's still alive," he whispered. "It learned to breathe without us." He unpacked a piece of chalk, the same one he had carried since that night. He wrote just 3 words on the corner of the board. "Keep climbing, always." Then he turned to the window. The city below was waking. Light struck the rooftops, and for an instant the glass around him caught the sun the way it had that first morning, gold spilling across the walls, illuminating everything. The same miracle, born again. He smiled. "Good morning, Professor." Weeks later, a small group of students gathered there every Saturday morning. Some were engineers, others poets, a few janitors' sons and daughters. They came to write, to test, to question. No one asked for ID, no one asked for permission. They called it the Glass Hour. One morning, as they worked, a reporter visited from Scientific American. She watched the sunlight cross the equations, then turned to Elias, who sat quietly at the back. "Do you ever regret giving it away?" she asked. He shook his head. "You can't give away what was never yours. You can only pass it forward." She smiled. "Then what will you write next?" Elias looked toward the students, their reflections overlapping on the window, golden and alive. "Not me," he said. "Them." That evening, long after everyone had gone, Elias stayed alone on the rooftop. He sat on the cold ledge where Hensley had once stood. The city hummed beneath him, the river silver in the moonlight. He took the key from his pocket, the one that had opened every forbidden door, and placed it gently on the concrete beside the engraved plaque. "For the next climber," he whispered. Then he rose, looked out across the skyline, and for a moment saw what Hensley must have seen that final night. The city as a great equation, full of motion, imperfection, and light. He raised his face to the wind. It smelled faintly of chalk dust and hyacinth. And as dawn began to rise, the glass walls ignited once more, not in memory, but in promise. A year later, Columbia hosted the first Open Sky Conference in that same hall. Researchers from across the world presented work inspired by the Rooftop equation. Some were young, some were old, none were famous. And when the final speaker finished, a moment of silence fell, not of grief, but of reverence. Then someone opened the blinds, and the morning sun spilled across the glass, painting every symbol gold. They stood together, hundreds of them, watching the light move. No one spoke. They didn't need to. For the first time, the rooftop belonged to everyone. Thank you for staying till the end. If this story touched you, remember, knowledge doesn't belong behind doors. It belongs to those who dare to climb. If you believe in stories like this, please subscribe, turn on the bell, and share it with someone who needs a little light today. See you in the next story, where another rooftop, another soul, will write what the world forgot to read.